you had this layoff because you got popped for drug use. How is that going to affect you?
Record-setting amount. Six supplements in one sample.
So was your urine fluorescent?
I believe the closest to me is 3. 6 in one. Can you believe another record for the bad guy?
I think if you're going to go out, you are going out at a record-setting pace.
If you're going down, go down big, man. To your question, is your question about drug testing?
I'm just curious about all of that whole scenario.
What happened back then?
All that.
So that wasn't a very hard road to go down. I went into a doctor, and it was a sports medicine guy, and they pull your blood, they check your levels, and there's different things that they look for, and I could make it extremely complex. But to dumb it down, they're really looking at there's 3 big things for sports. IGF-1 track, which means your growth hormone, which decreases over time. Mm-hmm. It doesn't get better with age. It goes down. 2 is testosterone, which, again, in men, it's the same thing. You get a little spike. That's kind of known as puberty, and then over time it goes down. And then 3 is what's known as your H&H levels, hemoglobin and hematocrit, which is like oxygen to blood and can kind of help with your endurance. So these are the big 3 things. So now the question comes, how do you manipulate them? And to manipulate them is fine. You can do that. That's within the rules as long as the substances you use are within the rules. So let's take testosterone because people will understand that one. The best way to up your testosterone is to take testosterone. The problem is the rules say otherwise. The rules say, yeah, Chael, that's a fair point, but you can't use testosterone. So there was other things you could use, but they didn't work as well. So, when you start going down that road, Nate, it was never ending. For me, when I did get grabbed, I made the joke about 6 things and one thing. Man, it could have been 8, it could have been 9. If I was in this doctor, I had a litmus test. I had a code like anybody else, and my code was nothing illegal, no steroids, and if it's from a doctor, I'm in. I couldn't buy it behind the Gold's Gym from a guy out of his trunk, out of a brown sack. I couldn't do that. If I could go to a doctor and I could get him to write a script for it, I slept just fine at night. Now, that's a flawed psychology. I do not endorse that. I'm ashamed of that. But to answer your question, that was my psychology. That was the psychology that I had that led me down that slope. So, as time changes, and I've been out of that world for a little bit now. So when I was talking earlier and telling the people, about your H&H levels, your growth hormone levels, and your testosterone levels, there could be more to that list by now. I don't know about them, but if I was still in that world and I did find out, now maybe I have to take 10 or 11 things to manipulate those. I don't know. I'm glad that's behind me. I hate when somebody gets caught for something. They go, it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me, because it's not. It's a humiliating thing that happened to you. But every now and then there are paths you get on in life that you can close your eyes and imagine where that would have taken you. So, no, this wasn't the greatest thing that ever happened to me. In fact, it was one of the worst, and it was one of the most embarrassing, and career-wise, it stopped my career in its tracks against my will. It was a terrible thing. But I think in fairness, particularly with the time that's gone by and reflecting, that was a real slippery slope I was on, Nate. That was a real slippery slope, and I don't know where that could have led. And it might be, in my case, true to say that's one of the best things that happened to me. In my case, that might be true.
Was it just something you were going to use to become a better competitor, to win fights? Is it that simple?
Yeah, essentially, and a lot of it is about training. A lot of it is about recovery. What can make you recover faster? Well, time is the number one thing, but we didn't always have that on our side. When Coach would set practice, if it was at 10 a.m. and it was again at 3 p.m., that's when practice. So if you can't recover between there, then what do? Mm-hmm. You show up a shell of yourself, or you take the day off, or you now, again, I'm sharing with you a flawed psychology. I'm not sharing with you an argumentative psychology that this is what should be done. But this was my flawed psychology at the time. So a lot of it was just in order to meet the schedule and be in the practice and be able to put in, an hour and 15 here in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. A lot of those supplements, particularly the testosterone, for me, was great for recovery. Great. I think that I probably have testosterone days ahead of me once my sports career is over. I've read on this stuff. I feel like I'm as close to an expert on this stuff. I've used it myself. I really like the medicine of testosterone, but I do agree with where sports stands that you got to pick one. If you think you need testosterone, then you can't combine sport and testosterone. I actually agree with that, which makes me a hypocrite. But down the road, if we're being fair right now, I think I will have testosterone days down the road, but the sport will be behind me.
But people are saying that you signed with Bellator as opposed to the UFC. UFC has this, what I feel is ridiculous. They've gone well over the top with drug testing. And I say that it sounds very simple for someone at home to say, oh, yeah, we should be drug tested. Well, imagine going into your work and you have to sign in everywhere you are 24 hours a day, have people show up at your house 24 hours a day. You want to take a vacation with the family. People are there. Nick Diaz getting busted for medical marijuana, which he has a prescription for. There has to be some give and take. All the other professional leagues have this to where it's a reasonable attempt at shutting down drug use that's going to taint the sport, but at the same time, show the respect that the athletes deserve. But that being said, people are going to say Bellator's drug testing is a lot easier on the athletes than the UFC's. Are you running away from the UFC's testing?
Yeah, so two-part question. The first part is an accurate statement. I think that Bellator's is easier than the UFC's because the UFC has what's known as random out-of-competition testing. Now, Bellator can do the same thing. What Bellator has done is what the UFC did for 20 years, which is, look, we're going to leave it up to the government. We're going to leave it up to the states. The UFC largely ended up in a PR mess where people just were attacking them for every side. And the UFC said repeatedly, what else do you want us to do? We're governed by the government who is seeing these drug tests. Well, that's a pretty good answer, but for whatever reason, it just would not go away. The media would not quit writing on it. And the UFC would say, what do you want us to do? They would literally say that in their answer. What do you want us to do? Well, somebody finally answered the question. Somebody finally said, we want USADA. And everybody else jumped on board and goes, yeah, USADA. So some people in the media really got married to those letters. So the UFC throws their hands up and goes, fine, then bring in this USADA group and leave it. We want to talk about fights, not about this testing. So power of the media, but that's kind of what happened there. Bellator doesn't have the budget where they've signed on this policy with USADA, but they do go by what the UFC went under for 20 years, which is each state can do their own thing. Now, in my case, my next fight will be in the state of California. They're regulated by Andy Foster, who is the most Mr. No-Nonsense of all the directors of all 50 states, and he's not afraid to spend the money. He has brought in USADA plenty of times. He just spends it out of the state fund as opposed to with the UFC has to pay for it by their fund. So I will likely still be tested by USADA, but in fairness, it's not 24/7. They couldn't. They're not going to just walk into the studio like they could have when I was in the UFC pool. So I wouldn't resist that because I have had people say that to me and go, well, the testing is more lax at Bellator. It's like, well, the testing is really strict at Bellator, but if you want to say it's more relaxed, okay, fair enough.
So why Bellator then?
I don't really have an answer as to why Bellator. I thought I was going into the UFC. When I started thinking about making a comeback, I was planning UFC and I was planning 185. I started to get my weight down. I started to stare at that division a little bit closer, look at the guys over there.
You're too fat.
It would have been hard. It would not have been fun. I had a ways to go, but I was fatter. I was fatter when I started this, so I was headed in the right direction. I got a little back and forth going with Tim Kennedy. I was kind of starting to align the stars to go back into the UFC at 185. I thought I was under contract with the UFC. Now, being under contract and not being under contract is as simple as the date on a contract. It's not complex. You just have to go stare at it. I hadn't stared at it, and I thought I was under contract with them. So when I was planning to make my comeback, I wasn't even open to it. So many people had said, well, look, if you come back, the big fight we want to see is you versus Wanderlei. Wanderlei's over in Ryzen right now. You got to get over to Ryzen. It's like, well, that's not even an option. I'm with the UFC. And so I didn't even have that dialogue or conversations or that thought in my head. Look a little bit closer. I was not under contract with the UFC. It really was as simple as that. And, I don't want to say too much because I was privy to some information, but Wanderlei and I are going to see each other a lot sooner than you would think.
Yeah, as I'm looking at the Bellator roster here, was it Bonner and Tito Ortiz?
Yep.
I believe it was the second highest rated free fight on TV. And when I saw this fight, I thought to myself, and Stefan's a good friend of mine. I'm acquaintances with Tito. Helped him get a surgery a few years ago that he needed. And I've known Stefan since the Ultimate Fighter. But I saw this fight and I went, two guys past their prime, not fighting for a title. And yet me, just like every other fan of the sport, is dying to see this fight because we know these names. And Bellator is scooping up all of the fan favorites that everybody loves, that I feel the UFC is, they're more marketing the UFC as a brand as opposed to the fighters. And they'll pick and choose their one or two, the Ronda Rousey, the Conor McGregor. But they're not building up the legions of fighters that drew everyone in as fans in the first place. And Bellator is scooping them up. I mean, whether it's a heavyweight Czech Congo or Matt Mitrione, which would be two exciting fights, you'd put on a little bit more weight for those. But yeah, definitely I'd rather see you against Tito Ortiz, Wanderlei Silva, if we can get Quentin Jackson in there, or even Stephan Bonner. There's some great matchups up there, and that's not even looking at the title for you.
Yeah. See, and I agree with that, and I've called it a Legends ass-whipping tour. I'm in a Legends ass-whipping tour. The bottom line is I got to fight whoever that's the way it works. It's kind of like this grappling event that Michael Chapman put on. I show up at this thing. There's 5 hammers in the weight that I didn't know, but that's kind of the way it works. If you say you want to do it, you got to take on anybody else that says I want to do it. So, but to your point, because it is a ratings business as opposed to the UFC, which was in the pay-per-view business for so long. So it is slightly different business models. And yes, some of those guys can really draw the numbers. The Stephan fight, I'm with you. It wasn't the most wonderful fight, and I didn't really have a vision that it was going to be, but it was worth every second of my 15 minutes that I watched it. Ken Shamrock is another one that continues to draw big numbers. Mm-hmm. I fall for it every time. I love the Ken Shamrock interviews. I love his entrance. I like the fight. I like whatever it is. Lately, it's been an excuse, but that he gives after the fact. I find it entertaining. I like when Hoist came back. Kimbo Slice, rest his soul, did huge numbers over there on Spike. And then you look at the presentation, and it's fantastic. They don't spare. There is no stone unturned budget-wise, and they make a really great event. So I think all of those things are alluring. When you look at the competition, you go, there's some pretty stiff guys over there. Liam's the champion. King Mo is always a problem at multiple weight classes. Mo fights wherever the hell he wants and gives people big trouble. You look at Phil Davis. Were you in the room when Phil came out here and trained at Team K? It was right when he started, but Phil was out here. I got to see him every day, worked out with him a bunch. And I could see back then, he was a young man, 23, 24 years old, but he worked really hard. You could tell, hey, we got a good athlete here that's willing to work hard. And now all of a sudden he's a number one contender. So you look at that division, there's all sorts of moving parts. They're talking about Fedor coming over. Rory McDonald is there already. He's talking about moving up. That would put him to 185, but he's talking about moving up. So, I mean, you could play this name game all day long. There's plenty of guys to match up with. And my answer is, look, I am cognizant that ratings matter. I am cognizant that Tito has a history of bringing in good ratings. But I'm much more cognizant of the fact that it's competition. It's just like what I went through on Saturday at this grappling event. Man, it's anybody, any age, whoever wants to go at it, and you're fighting for your spot. And if you're not good enough to keep it, well, that's the reality of the business too.
I could be talking out of my ass here, but I think one of the reasons why Couture was so successful was in his wrestling career. He put so much stress, so much pressure on himself to get to the Olympics, to win the Olympics, that it didn't happen for him. And then when he had this second opportunity to just go out and fight, it's like there was no pressure. This is just his second go-round. And now that the pressure was released, and I recall doing visualization exercises with him before the fights, where it was all about just flowing and everything is fun, and he's able to just go out there and compete. I feel like this is the exact same thing for you, where the UFC was this pressure to go out there and compete and win. Like you said, it's now you get to go out and fight the legends. I feel like you're coming almost out of retirement to come in and live your dream again, with no pressure to succeed, just go out and have fun and deliver some beatings.
I never thought about it in those terms, but that is spot on now that you've articulated it. That is true. There is a funness. Now, that'll go away. You know full well that once you get that contract, a new stress gets added.